Read the
All
way.
right. So today we're talking about myth number 3 in Kevin Crossley-Holland's The Norse Myths, which is the building of Asgard's wall. It's on page 9, and the notes are on page
185.
uh just to recap the myth, it's about a giant who honestly, and I want to focus on the words honesty and treachery, a giant who disguises himself as a presumably a human.
Rock. Yeah, I guess so.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
At the end,
yeah,
he reveals himself as a rock giant, but
yeah.
it says, this is how matters stood for some time. Paragraph 2. This is how matters stood for some time until one day a solitary figure on horseback cantered over the trembling rainbow and was stopped by the watchman Heimdall.
Mhm.
So this is again really indicative of like what is the nature of a giant. Are they physically distinguishable from regular beings like gods and people? Because we know the gods are physically indistinguishable from humans,
Mhm.
or at least they can disguise themselves easily as humans. And it appears that giants are also able to do the same thing. And so, is this disguising like a physical transformation? Because there seems to be a really clear distinction between the kind of shape shifting that Freya and Loki are able to do and this like regular old disguising that like Odin does.
Mhm.
So there is a giant who disguises himself as a human who honestly wants to make a bargain with the gods. And the bargain is that he will rebuild the wall if he can get Freya, the sun, and the moon as payment. And so the gods treacherously, very treacherously, attempt to trick this giant
Mhm.
by saying, well, you have to do it within 6 months. And if any of the part of the wall is unbuilt within 6 months, then the deal's off. The idea being that there's no way he could possibly do this. And if the person isn't able to complete the wall, then at least they have like half the wall built for free and for nothing, says Loki. And like, this is all incredibly treacherous. Okay, it's like straight up they're attempting to trick this giant who has an honest proposal. Let
Mhm.
me rebuild your wall. And I love, there's even this part on page 11, paragraph 3. Impossible terms, says the builder, and you know it. He paused and gazed at Freya. But my longing, he said, my longing. He gazed at Freya again. Then at least allow me the help of my stallions, Father Fari.
Mhm.
And it's like, it's really clear. He really wants to marry Freya. And he's
Mhm.
attempting to strike a bargain with the gods to do so, very honestly.
Mhm.
Then, to make matters even more treacherous, at the end of the myth, the gods coerce Loki into fixing this thing that they all fucking agreed to. They blame him. It was your idea.
Yep.
And they twist his arm. Odin quite literally twists his arm and says, "You will do this."
Yep.
To which Loki says, "Okay," transforms himself into this mare and coerces the giant stallion, who's been doing all the heavy lifting, into fucking going off and fucking him for a day.
Yep.
And thereby not being able to carry the load of rock, and then causing a large enough delay that the giant doesn't isn't able to complete his work. And if even that weren't enough, once this giant reveals himself as a giant, they say, "Oh well, then the deal's totally definitely off anyway. Thor, why don't you just go and slaughter it?" Like, instead of just saying like, "Sorry, we had a deal and you didn't finish the wall, so
Mhm.
take off back to Jotunheim." No, they just kill him.
Yeah. Well, he bursts into this towering figure of a rock giant in rage. And then
Yes,
as
at
soon as they
having
realize
been,
he's a giant, without a second thought, they send for Thor.
but they realized this already at the beginning of the myth when they saw how much he was able to push
Yeah,
the
they
rock.
knew.
They said, oh, he must be a giant or something in disguise. Like they started to suspect this, but they did nothing
Mhm.
because they wanted to have their wall rebuilt.
Yeah.
So in wanting to have their wall, so now let's go and see what Kevin Crossley-Holland has to say.
Mhm.
Okay. I wonder if in the process of compiling and translating this story, he actually read it, because it
Okay.
seems like maybe he didn't. Maybe he actually, like, obviously he did, but his bias of what he wants to believe about the society that the story comes from, about like just everything. It's what he wants to believe about the Vikings
Mhm.
really comes through in his notes. And this is one of the sets of Kevin's notes that I find to be preposterous. All
Mhm.
right. And the things that I want to point out are in the gods were far from unblemished, and the giants were not told. This is from paragraph 2 on page 185, or from paragraph
Mhm.
2 of the notes. The gods were far from unblemished, and the giants were not totally destructive. Several gods even married giantesses, but in the end, the antagonism of gods and giants can only be seen as the conflict of good and evil.
Mhm.
The gods embody aspects of natural and social order, which is why they break their oaths and trick people.
Yeah.
Okay. The giants subvert that order and seek to overthrow it, which was not at all displayed in this myth
Yeah.
at all. The
Yeah.
opposite was displayed in this myth. The nature of their conflict shows clearly in the giant mason's price, right? That it's the devil. It's normally the devil that wants your soul for this bargain, and it's like no, he literally just wanted, like, it's obvious that Kevin is sexually Puritan.
Mhm.
Okay, he believes that wanting a sex object is by its very nature evil,
Mhm.
and cannot see past that far enough to see that the being subverting natural order and what is it, natural and social order in this story are the gods.
Yep.
Okay, then there's the second thing that I want to point out, and then I'll let you comment on all of these things here. um, the first myth which Loki comes into play, he's fully considered in the introduction. Snorri Sturluson says that Loki is called the mischief monger of the Aesir and the father of lies and the disgrace of gods and men. When in this myth, he was really trying to aid them,
Mhm.
doing his best to say, we could make use of this situation. Let's get us a wall to protect us, which we all want. We all want the wall. We all
Mhm.
want protection. I have a way to get it. And then when the way doesn't pan out, which everyone agreed to, they all blame him and force him to make it right, which he does, which
Mhm.
he then does at their behest, and then gifts Odin a horse, which can carry him anywhere, even down the
Yeah.
long road to, and then very, very slyly out of the corner of his mouth says, what other horse can bear you all the way down the dark path to Niflheim and back? And then
Yeah.
Odin's like, wait, so is that where you've been all these months? Then, in paragraph on page 186, in the second full paragraph, bisexuality was not a characteristic that appealed to the early Icelanders. Based on what evidence, Kevin?
Yeah.
And homosexuality was a crime punishable by outlawry. Now, this, my friend Kagan, this is a consequence of the mistranslation of ergi
Mhm.
and orgr. It did not mean effeminacy or homosexuality. It meant cowardliness. And
Mhm.
it was mistranslated by people living in a society that was currently wrestling with the idea of homosexuality as an immutable sexual identity. Okay. And Kevin Crossley-Holland is falling prey to this mistranslation. He does have a good reason to say this, because it would appear, based on our current translation of ancient Icelandic law, that homosexuality or effeminacy would have been a crime punishable by outlawry. Now, what he means is calling somebody this unduly was actually the crime that was punishable by outlawry. Not being this, it
Mm.
was calling someone this with no reason.
Right.
Okay, naming someone Ergi without them actually being Ergi was punishable by outlawry. It was not acceptable.
Mm.
So, all this to say, and then I'll then I want to hear what you have to say. All this to say, Kevin Crossley-Holland doesn't care about the historicity of these myths. As far as he's concerned, they could have all been written by Snorri and it would be just as interesting to him.
Mhm.
I believe that this particular myth, in its full and expandedness, and based on what Kevin has to say in the notes about the sources for this myth and how incredibly sparse they are, was hands down written by Snorri as a way of introducing Loki as a villain. Now, I'm not so sure why he chose to then vilify the gods in consequently in this story. But maybe he did have access to sources that we don't have anymore today. Maybe there was a more expanded source for the building of the wall that he was leaning on that included the treachery of the gods, and that he was being faithful to that while still placing his own ideas about the figure of Loki within embedding them into the text. Um, so I think that this is one example of where Kevin has completely gotten it wrong in his interpretation and just doesn't have the cultural context that he would need to fully interpret this myth.
Mm. Well, I agree on those points. I think that his interpretations are definitely painted by what he wants to see from his cultural context. And I think the most interesting points that the myth makes comes when we disregard his interpretation of them. But to speak on his points, I really don't like his moralization because it does, as you've already stated, completely ignore the explicitly obvious behavior of all parties involved, as you've already described, where it does not make sense to me how he can so easily ignore the moral duplicitness of the gods and treat them as some kind of stalwart of societal norms and morals. It's like they're clearly taking advantage of this outsider for their own benefit and slaughter him in cold blood, and you claim they're the good guys. And I understand he makes a good enough point in saying that the consequences of the rock giant's request, if played out, would be catastrophic. That's fair. But it also contributes to me, and I don't know if this is a reflection of his retelling or if it's a reflection of original interpretations. And this is part of what I wanted to discuss when we remove his interpretation, so it's a good segue, is the picture that this interaction paints between cultural groups, because it shows a inherent distrust of outsiders and a willingness to, not only a willingness, but an acceptable behavior in manipulating outsiders for your own benefit and a disregard for their own safety and life. And I could see an AFA member read this story and find in it moral justification for not trusting outsiders.
Yes.
That is definitely a bad thing. And I think that interpreting the relationships between the gods and the giants in this context requires serious analysis. And if we were to engage in a project of writing the myths in a modern context, this one would be a problematic myth because of its depiction of these insider-outsider relations. Now, in an issue where, say, the rock giants are already established as being an antagonistic force, and the people of the gods and the giants themselves are already at war with each other for whatever reason, it makes sense that they would never trust this giant outright. They're at war. It makes sense. But to go so far as to have this giant just appear by himself and offer this thing in return for these things that he clearly sincerely wishes for himself, especially his longing for Freya, the relationship seems less antagonistic on the face of it and more just, no, the gods are being assholes. And so what do you make of that? I think is something to theologize about. And yeah, it requires a lot of thinking. And again, I want to highlight that how much of this is a reflection of Snorri Sturluson or Kevin Crossley-Holland or the original storytellers, we can never know, because the original sources and the way that they were told are completely lost to us.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it interesting. And at the same time, in internalizing or realizing that this giant is a rock giant, he's in himself a manifestation of nature. He's a rock giant. He wants to build a wall. What are you going to use for that? You're going to use rocks and lumber. He's a personification of nature that's to be exploited. So you can see the symbolic human nature relationship happening as well, where nature in itself as a raw chaotic force is there to be exploited. It's not there to be respected. And so depersonifying nature through the rock giant and stripping it of its human-esque visage, we can also see a justification for the abuse of our natural environment at its expense. And the threat that it poses to us and what it demands from us. And so I think this myth is rich in opportunities to analyze relationships. And that is my major contribution to my take on this myth. I think it very, very interesting. And I mean, I would be curious as to your thoughts on that.
Like, I'm glad that you brought this up, because that's exactly, those are my thoughts coming in before I read the notes and went like, wait, what, Kevin, what? And then of course that's like mainly what I want to talk about, because I like to be smarter than other people. But no, that was like kind of at the top of my mind when I was reading the whole myth, was like, what does this say about acceptable morality, or even, I think it says less about acceptable moral duplicity in this tradition than it says about simply the lack of good old-fashioned Christian values in this tradition. Namely, there were none. We also can't really say that, because for a very long time, Christians did participate in like horrific activities that they justified with this insider-outsider perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But we are God's people. They are not. We are. So we can slaughter them. Like, where God wants us to slaughter them en masse. It was not until the Renaissance that the idea of the value of human life, the value of every person, was introduced into European political thinking.
Mhm.
And that was a very human thing. It had nothing to do with religion. It had to do with people that were building new governments, saying, well, we are the people that have been shit on forever, and we're now responsible for writing this document. And how are we going to write it? Well, we're going to write in the value of every person,
Mhm.
which then carried itself over into the church in order for the church to survive. The church had to adopt these new modes of thinking, and they had to start really taking the words of Jesus seriously, which they had done now for the first time in over 1,000 years. And
Mhm.
in about 1,500 years, for the very first time, they started taking those words seriously, like the words of pacifism and whatever. Never mind that there were pacifists acting in the early 1500s who were saying, hey, maybe we should pay attention to these parts of the Bible, but never mind them.
Mhm.
We'll just burn them all at the stake.
Yep.
So I think that what this really says is this: there is no. First of all, it's indicative of a lack, and I believe it. I believe in this lack of absolute moral forces. There is no such thing as absolute morality. Morality is relative. Um, Morality is only useful insofar as it allows us to work together as a group or between groups. And I think that that is really on display here, as you say, is this: we will work together insofar as it benefits us until it doesn't, and then all bets are off.
Mhm.
And this behavior has been seen throughout the ages. And so what can we really take away from this in a theological sense? Last time we touched on this idea of, as above, so below.
Mhm.
The Aesir Vanir War being a representation of something that happened on Earth, and the thing that happened on Earth being a representation of this war.
Mhm.
And I believe similarly that this exploitation of natural forces by the gods, and I've been doing a lot more thinking about this, like, gods and giants idea, and if this idea that the Aesir are on this one, like, really human end of the spectrum,
Mhm.
and more towards the middle of the spectrum are the Vanir that represent, like, not just human life but life, living things. And then you get to this other end of the spectrum where, like, the things we call giants are representations of these non-living forces, the winds and the snow and the fire and the rocks.
Yep.
And so I'm starting to see it more as, like, it's like, yes, they're all the same kind of being, right? They're all the same kind of white. They're a white that lives on the highest plane.
Mhm.
Um, but the different names we give them symbolize the domains
Yep.
that are not mutually exclusive, right?
Mhm.
I think I agree with you now on that point, that, like, the Vanir dip into human activity as much as they dip into, like, non-living. Like, Njord is a god of the sea. The water is not alive. The water harbors life.
Mhm.
The water gives life, but it itself is not a living force. It is very much an immutable natural force.
Mhm.
Um, and then the giants as being part of this domain of, like, snow, rock, stone, fire, things that will always be there, have always been there. We see this represented in the fact that all gods are descended from giants, that everything that is alive was born of a giant,
Mhm.
and that these giants have always been there. Um, I just read the Vafthrudnismal, And in it, Vafthrûdnir tells us that the first giant was born of venom dripping into a sea by a snake. I'm like, where did the snake come from? And where did the sea? And it's this whole like thing, like this eternal nature of what was there first and what was there before that and what was there before that, and this
Mm.
unanswerable question. And so presumably the giants have simply always been there, right? And this idea that, oh, the first giant was formed by venom curdling together and inside the sea, is like, no, it's just an excuse for, it's just an answer to the question, what was there before, when really Orgelmir was probably just always there, and that he birthed the first of the race of giants, and so on and so forth. Um, so I think that when it comes back to, what can we really take away from this, it's that yes, we need to be careful not to simply assign values of good and evil to
Hmm.
these deities. We need to be careful to really strictly consider why we are acting the way that we are. What will it bring? What are the consequences?
Yeah.
We see from this that the gods are fallible.
Mhm.
We see from this that they are not all knowing and all wise. They had no idea this was going to happen the way that it did. And we need to be careful to not to ascribe these universal qualities to them. We were talking about someone before this, and that person really likes to say things like the gods X, the gods Y, the gods are this way, the gods feel this way, they love us, they
Mhm.
want the best for us. And in doing so, strips them of their individualities, strips them of their mutability, strips them of having the same nature as people,
Their
which they
agency.
do. Yeah. This fallibility, this propensity to want things and to let that wanting cloud their judgment. It affects even the all wise, as Odin, right, is one of the most susceptible to having his judgment clouded by his own desires.
Yep.
And so it's like that, I think, is what we can really take away from this story.
Hmm. And I think in doing that and showing us the fallibility of our gods at the same time, it really challenges us because we can look at them as examples of some of the best qualities in us. And at the same time, they're also demonstrations of the worst. And so when we look at this myth, like I said, how an AFA member could read this story and find it moral justification for not trusting foreign groups, can we look at this myth and say to ourselves, in this story, we learn how not to be like the gods. We learn from their mistakes. Can we say that they made a mistake in what they did? Because they did come out on top. So it raises a lot of questions because if we can say that, yes, we recognize what they did is morally wrong, whose morals are we basing it off of, ours or theirs? And what does this say about our relationship to our gods? Can we really respect them when we can say outright, no, they were wrong? So it ends up raising a lot of questions. And in pointing this, I'm not trying to say that the AFA are right in any capacity because they're not. And I think that we need to,
Disclaimer.
yeah,
Disclaimer heard loud and clear. Yes.
disclaimer, racism's bad. Disclaimer.
Yeah. Yes.
Um, um, I think it dangerous to use this myth in such a way. And I think that we need to interpret it to say Do we really want to behave that way? And can we be better than our gods? And I want to say yes. And it brings up these questions of again, as above, so below. They're infallible, so are we. We make mistakes, so do they. And how do we do better? Can we do better? And how can we change our relationship with nature, not only in our lived lives, but in our myths? Can the gods not reconsolidate, but blanking on the term. It starts with C. But come to terms with the giants. Can the gods and the giants put the war between them aside and shake hands? Reconcile. That's the word that I'm looking for. Can they do that? Is it possible? And it makes me think of Ragnarok and the representation of Surtur and his coming in and burning everything, and the connection that so many pagans today make with that imagery and global warming, with the realization that human society will get caught up in this cataclysmic war and be destroyed, and humans, although not wiped out, will be brought low to our fewest, and from there new gods will carry us forward. And it makes me wonder, can we change that fate? And if not, maybe this is all deserved. Maybe we can see in that inevitability, that prophecy, that cataclysm is a cleaning of the slate, a hard wake-up call that if we do not connect with nature in a positive relationship, we will be destroyed. And it's from that realization that we can start again and continue and move on, because we see the deaths of Odin, we see the deaths of Thor and other gods, and all these traditions and histories that we see in their behavior in these myths, like this one, with their relationship with nature. It's like you can see the cataclysm coming from the beginning with this conflict between them, and how the giants are impossible to overcome in the end. We live in their space, and we can build a wall if we want, but it will crumble because we make that wall of them, and
Yeah, they built it.
they built it. So
I think that's one, now that you say that, sorry, I just want to interject that like it brings up this thought of there's a line in the story, in the very beginning of the story, everyone wanted the wall, but nobody wanted to shoulder the burden of building it themselves.
yeah,
Right? These powerful gods, it wasn't so important to them that it, I mean it was, but like nobody wanted to shoulder that burden, right? I think that you're also raising this image to me of fate,
hmm.
in which I am a strong believer. And sometimes through the illusion of free will, I forget that we've all been fated, and that the giant, who's never named, I believe,
I don't think so.
was fated. Presumably, the Norns had determined that this is the way he would die. Presumably, they determined that Thor would kill him. Presumably, they determined that all the gods would fall prey to Loki's scheme, that Loki would have the idea that he had, that the gods would want the wall so badly they would all agree to it. So as we have this discussion, it's like, yeah, we can take away lessons like how can we do things differently, and we can take away things to think about. right? Ways of framing our own lives and our own choices. But I think that at the end of the day, we need to be careful when talking about choice. I don't know how you exactly feel about the fate idea and the idea of the Norns,
Mm.
but I think that, as humans living a human experience, obviously it's not completely useless for us to think about our morality. It's not completely useless for us to think about the decisions that we make. Like, we need to occupy our brain space somehow
Yeah.
throughout this like painful existence. Um, but kind of realizing that we can say they made the right choice or the wrong choice, but at some point we need to accept that it was the only choice. And yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that idea.
Mm. So I feel that my perception of fate aligns very well with the Norse concept of weird, and the fact that our futures are simultaneously malleable and determined, where our choices will lead to certain things, but those things are also not guaranteed. But it's our choices that inform them. And so
Yes, I
I
agree.
had,
I just want to
yeah.
say that.
This was before I was even identified as heathen. I remember asking myself about the the certainty of historical events and looking at World War II as an example and thinking, could certain events in history be guaranteed to happen? And then everything in between those certain events is completely malleable. And I think about how I can compare that idea to the Norse conception of Ragnarok as this certainty, where everything else isn't so certain, and how you can predict a future, but the only thing that makes it certain is your behavior toward making that happen or not. It's complicated, but the important point being that it's our actions that determine our futures. And then if we behave a certain way and we maintain that behavior, the certainty of a future happening only becomes more and more solid, especially as it comes closer. So we can change our behavior in order to change the future, but then that just creates another path that's possible. And I think that that's the way. And looking at our own trajectory right now and the likelihood of Ragnarok happening, it's a certainty looking at how the world is. But we can change our behaviors in order to change things that happen around that event. Because I know that if we were to behave in a particular way, we could guarantee our extinction. And Ragnarok would still happen, but the outcome of Ragnarok with surviving humans wouldn't. Ragnarok would be an extinction event, not a bringing low, but it would still happen. And I think that once we behave a certain way up to a certain point in time, we really lock in certain things as happening. So technically, fate exists, but it's malleable enough that far away enough we can change it from happening. And I think that's part of the danger in predicting the future, because they had this relationship with seers as particularly dangerous, as frightening, their ability to see the future as threatening in and of itself. And I think the relationship with the Norns can be just as scary. In it's like the idea of knowing how you die, and then that feeling like there's no way to avoid that, and the anxiety, the
Yeah.
anticipatory anxiety associated with, I'm one step closer to that now.
Well, it's almost like I don't. Uh,
I feel like I'm rambling,
so
but
no, it's okay. I want to respond to what you say before we're out of time because I do need to go at noon.
okay.
Um, meaning I want to talk to you for 10 more minutes after we've end up recording at noon
Yeah.
about something that's completely unrelated.
Yeah.
Fate. As an atheist, I believed in absolute predestination.
Okay.
I went the opposite way that most people go. As an
Yeah, for an
atheist, I believe
atheist.
in absolute predestination in the sense that I am a firm believer in chaos theory. I believe in the ordered nature of a chaotic universe. I believe in world lines. I believe that everything that can happen, could be happening at this moment, is happening on some world line somewhere, and that my consciousness is experiencing one of those lines. And that that line is predestined. And that which the forks, the directions my consciousness takes at every fork has been predetermined. In the faith, I believe that words are wind, but words are also the word. That our intentions are heard by the norms and influence their decision making. We can never forget that the norns are our gods, that presumably hear us and are aware of us and are active today. They didn't write the fate and then die.
Mm-hmm.
They're still writing it.
Yep.
Right? As time, the every day, constantly, and that our words, our intention setting, is what influences them, not tells them what to do. No, I look at them as judges, real human judges, right? Sitting in a courtroom. I don't know if you've ever had to appear before a judge, but this terror, this fear of being completely at the mercy of another person
Hmm.
is what expresses when you're sitting before a judge.
Hmm.
Because you realize suddenly this person has the power to compel you absolutely to do something uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
something you don't want to do, something that can strip you of your freedom and your agency, something that can put you in the company of people that might endanger your life.
Yeah.
And that there's this like real, there's this like gravity that hits you in that moment, and that's the awe that I feel before the norns. And as with judges, you have to be very careful what you say.
Yeah.
You have to be careful the intentions you set vocally, verbally. And I feel that we can feel their power when we verbally announce intentions. There's a difference. It feels different to say something out loud than to just think it to yourself in your head.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in that sense, I believe that yes, we do, as believers, have a sense of agency that we don't as atheists. And lastly, I'll just say that it's not a Norse image, but a Greek image of spinning the threads of fate.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that image very fitting when we think about string theory.
Yeah.
And we think about the idea that our whole reality is made up of these vibrations.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the image, the string theory doesn't mean there's actual strings vibrating and
Yeah.
they form the universe. It's the patterns of vibrations that are essentially cause the illusion of matter. And that's why quarks behave so unpredictably. And I believe that if we're going to unify physics with faith, quarks are the tools of the norms. Quarks are the way that they act in the human world. They're the medium of communication, if you will. They exist on this other plane that we don't know of, that we can't go to. We have no idea what the physical nature of this plane is. But they, as the gods, have to physically interact somehow, and that could be a way that they do it. And so at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, I think that from this story, yeah, we again, the main point for me is we need to be careful with our intentions, careful with what we assign and ascribe to the gods. We don't know them.
Mhm.
I personally reject the idea of having this close friendship with gods. Even if one feels that way, it can never truly be trusted. This story shows that to us, and many other stories show that to us as well. Gods befriend people all the time with treacherous motives,
Yeah,
and that they're to be respected and feared.
I agree.
Um, so,
My last comment on that, you had brought up this idea of, like, just to finish the conversation on fate for starters, you had mentioned predestination being a thing and bringing up the imagery of threads and these branching paths. If we think of it through like multiversal theory, where like there's infinite universes, infinite recombinations of everything, keeping that in mind, the idea of choice is an illusion just as much as the idea of predestination being an illusion, because every possibility happens. The idea that your life is certain, it cannot be, because it's just one of the infinite variations of what could have been. Everything has happened, everything will happen, so nothing is certain, but it is. But it's not certain for you, like specifically. It will happen, but maybe not to this version of you.
exactly.
So I think that's interesting.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so I think when we question the idea of like, is fate true? I think that that's a question that's not worth pursuing in the end. And I think that we can throw that out the window and look again at myths like this and say, if we throw away the idea of predestination being fact, we see their behavior, we see what they've predicted, that Ragnarok is coming, and we know as moral people, independent of the gods, their behavior was wrong. We can act in a better way. And we see the consequences of their behavior in Ragnarok. Would we want this? No. So let's do what Odin's done and decide, despite this prophecy, looking for every way we can find that can subvert it, even if it doesn't happen. Try our best to subvert it, be different, be better. Because if as above, so below, maybe our behavior can make their world better. And
Maybe.
if maybe, and if we can retell the myths in a more positive way and make that true, feel it to be true, believe it to be true, then maybe we can change things for the better. Maybe Ragnarok won't have to be as cataclysmic as it's been predicted. But I think for that, we need to take back control of it, take it out of the history books and put it into a lived religious experience.
Definitely. On that note, on that really beautiful note, I'm going to end the recording.